Cannabis Common Sense, the show that tells the truth about marijuana and the politics behind its prohibition.
Hello and welcome to another exciting edition of Cannabis Common Sense. Tonight we have a great guest, Janna Champagne, a retired RN who's been leading education at university, medical school teacher on cannabis and the endocannabinoid system. We'll be talking to her about many things that have happened with her world, autism in cannabis, different pathways for cannabis, so stay tuned for that. First of all, that we have a short but interesting hemp news segment. So without further ado, we will bring on the infamous dancing cannabis leaves.
I feel the force.
Okay, our first story tonight is from Washington, D.C. The head of the United States Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, is aiming to present President Joe Biden federal cannabis scheduling decision, quote, this year, end quote, as agencies work, quote, as quickly as we can, end quote, to complete an administrative review, according to DHS Secretary Javier Becerra. And he said that during a press briefing in Sacramento last week. While Becerra and other federal officials had previously emphasized that they are working expeditiously to carry out the cannabis review, which the president directed late last year, there's been a lack of clarity about the specific timeline. Now the secretary has disclosed when he hopes to deliver on the president's directive. The Food and Drug Administration, FDA, under HHS, is carrying out an 8-step scientific review into marijuana to determine whether it should be rescheduled, descheduled, or remain in Schedule 1. Of course, we hold it should be descheduled entirely. Schedule 1 is reserved for the most strictly controlled drugs in the Controlled Substances Act, and cannabis is in there. Secretary Becerra said, quote, what I can tell you is that the president instructed us at HHS and FDA in particular to take a look at how we treat marijuana to see if we can update our review of marijuana as a drug and how we can make sure how we treat it going forward on the federal level. Places like California have already changed the laws and the federal government has not. And so we've been instructed and we're underway with that review as we speak, end quote. Well, hopefully that will come to fruition soon. Also from the federal government, Section 280E of the Internal Revenue Code, or IRC, for the Internal Revenue Service, or IRS, explicitly prohibits businesses engaged in the trade or distribution of either Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 controlled substances from deducting expenses on their federal taxes. Because marijuana is still federally recognized as a Schedule 1 substance under the Controlled Substances Act, state legal cannabis businesses that operate in adult and medical use markets cannot deduct their ordinary business expenses from their federal taxes. In short, these businesses, despite being authorized under state law, are still considered drug traffickers in the eyes of the IRS, and as such, are liable under the provisions of Section 280E. This translates to entirely state legal cannabis businesses paying astronomically higher taxes than other businesses. According to one recent economic analysis, in 2022, cannabis operators paid in excess of $1.8 billion in additional taxes because of the IRS 280E rule. This excess tax burden is destroying cannabis businesses financially. To combat this, several states have enacted legislation addressing 280E in order to assist in easing business state-level tax burden. These states include California, Colorado, Connecticut, Illinois, New Jersey, and Oregon. Other states are considering enacting similar legislation, including New York and Pennsylvania. However, while these state-level changes may reduce some of the excessive tax burdens facing these businesses, they cannot provide federal tax relief, which can only be accomplished by either the passage of explicit federal 280E reform or by the removal of cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act. We can hope Secretary Becerra does that. In New York City, children exposed to cannabis in utero, or in the mother's womb, do not exhibit clinical neurodevelopmental deficits later in life, according to data published in the journal Pediatric and Prenatal Epidemiology. Columbia University researchers assessed neurodevelopment in a cohort of 2,868 children born between 1989 and 1992. Study participants were evaluated in late childhood and again in early adulthood. After researchers adjusted for co-founders, the children exposed to cannabis in utero performed no differently or in any assessments as compared to those who were unexposed. The study's authors concluded, quote, Children with prenatal marijuana exposure did not perform worse on neuropsychological assessments than unexposed children at ages 10 and again at ages 19 and 20. Further research is warranted in a more contemporary birth cohort with range of neuropsychological outcomes to further elucidate the effect of prenatal marijuana exposure on neurodevelopment. End quote. The study's findings are consistent with several prior cohort studies evaluating the long-term health outcomes associated with in utero cannabis exposure. A 2017 review of those studies concluded, quote, the evidence base for maternal infant health outcomes of cannabis use in pregnancy is more robust than for many other substances. Although there's a theoretical potential for cannabis to interfere with neurodevelopment, human data drawn from 4 prospective cohorts have not identified any long-term or long-lasting meaningful differences between children exposed in utero to cannabis and those not, end quote. This study, Neurodevelopment Outcomes in Children After Prenatal Exposure, appears in Pediatric and Prenatal Epidemiology. Our next story is from Louisiana. Democratic Governor John Bel Edwards signed legislation, Louisiana House Bill 286, into law facilitating the expungement of cannabis possession convictions. The new law took effect upon passage. The law allows first-time marijuana possession offenders in Louisiana to file a request for an expungement of their records after 90 days of their conviction. Next story is from Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Republican Governor Kevin Stitt has vetoed legislation, Senate Bill 437, that sought to impose new rules limiting patients' medical cannabis access. Changes proposed by the bill included requiring recommending physicians to participate in a state registry, mandating younger patients to receive recommendations from multiple physicians, one of whom had been the patient's primary provider for at least 1 year, and requiring regulators to create new rules limiting the amount of THC in certain edible products. Because the 2023 Oklahoma legislative session is already adjourned, their lawmakers will not have an opportunity to override the governor's veto. Oh. Our last story tonight is from right here in Oregon. Federal criminal investigators in late May sent subpoenas to 5 Oregon agencies for records concerning former Secretary of State Shemia Fagan and the owners of the cannabis company La Mota, Aaron Mitchell and Rosa Cazares, whom Fagan worked for as a private consultant, Oregon Public Broadcasting reported. Fagan stepped down from her government role as Secretary of State back on May 8th after it was discovered that she'd taken a consultant role, and her office had prepared an audit of cannabis state regulations that was viewed as favorable to cannabis companies. Following her resignation, the state launched 2 investigations, one into whether Fagan broke state ethics law, and another focused on the audit. Federal prosecutors have convened a grand jury focused on the scandal, although it's unclear the nature of the investigation. Assistant U.S. Attorney Ethan Knight, chief of the office's Economics Crime Unit, in late May sent the subpoenas to the Secretary of State's office, the Oregon Department of Revenue, the Oregon Government Ethics Commission, the Oregon Liquor and Cannabis Commission, and the Department of Administrative Services, seeking records back to 2018. Prior to former Secretary of State Fagan's resignation, she said she faithfully followed Oregon's ethics rules and laws, end quote. From the OLCC, federal officials requested documents regarding the audit carried out under Fagan's tenure, along with any records dealing with Cazares or Mitchell, and, quote, any communication to or from Shemia Fagan regarding the marijuana cannabis industry, end quote, among other things, according to the documents. From the Secretary of State's office, investigators requested records related to Fagan's employment, schedules, travel itineraries, use of the official credit cards, call and text records, and campaign finance records. They're also seeking communication with Cazares and Mitchell and records of the couple's campaign finance contributions. From the Ethics Commission, investigators subpoenaed documents related to, quote, ethical discussions, questions, or conflicts of interest related to Shemia Fagan and or her election campaigns, end quote. And from the Department of Revenue, quote, any communication to or from Shemia Fagan regarding Aaron Mitchell or Rosa Cazares, end quote. Well, we'll see how that turns out. We have a great interview tonight with a former registered nurse, Janna Champagne. She's been teaching college courses on cannabis. We'll be talking about that in addition to developing specific cannabis tinctures for various conditions. We'll be talking about that as well as travails and with the Oregon State Board of Nursing. So stay tuned for an interesting interview, very fascinating. I learned a few things. And if you or a loved one are looking for a doctor who can help you get a medical marijuana permit, well, we know doctors all over the country and we'll be happy to refer you to help you get that permit. If you need that, give us a call at 503-235-4606. That's 503-235-4606. And here's our interview with Janna Champagne. And remember to help restore hemp. Good night. I would like to welcome back to the show Janna Champagne, who is a retired nurse who was back on a couple of years ago. I think you were just in the midst of considering retiring then and coming out with a CBD line. But
you've been doing a lot, and I'm very happy to have you back on the show, Janna.
Yeah, and thanks for having me, Paul. I'm excited to be here. I think it's been a little too long. We have quite a lengthy update today. So
Yeah, well, and things keep changing. There's another title there at the end of your name. Is it DCMS or?
yeah, close. It's DMCS. It stands for Diplomate of Medical Cannabinoid Science. And I obtained that when I retired my nursing license, just to kind of formalize my cannabinoid education and my qualifications to do so. I am working as a college professor now, educating cannabinoid science to future integrative medicine students at John Patrick University. In addition to, I did start that CBD line. It's Unity Formulas, and it's targeted formulations. They offer free nurse guidance. Great program. They meet the flow criteria, which I preach about a lot for optimal therapeutic medical cannabis quality. Kind of hard to find, but I have, in my work with patients, I just found that was so profound to match them up with a product that was not only optimal quality, but also really targeted for specific needs. So if they have anxiety, they try the anxiety formula. Keep it really simple and build in that education and support by a nurse that can also make a really big difference for patients. So,
Tell us about the flow modality and how that works.
The flow criteria is an acronym for flower derived, lab tested, organic, and whole plant spectrum, meaning that the producer has concentrated the flower as nature intended without deliberately stripping away any compounds from the hundreds that are found in the flower. And what we find is that, when cannabis products are produced this way, they tend to work much more effectively in the body. They tend to work at much lower dosing for the same effects, to the tune of 25 to 30% of what you might need of an isolate per the research. And so it really is important that patients who are seeking cannabis for medical use and really seeking optimal therapeutic outcomes understand that not all products are equal in helping them meet those goals. And you can find out more about that at my website, cannabisnurseapproved.com, which has the flow article that explains it all with the research citations, and also has a free listing of producers that meet the flow criteria and free nurse guidance as well. So
great.
Yeah.
We'll have to do that again a little bit later in the show.
Sure.
There've been a lot of issues with nurses. Where do you want to start with the regulatory authority, the nursing board? They've been, I know you worked with our friend Lee Berger, an attorney, in trying in litigating and changing that. Would you kind of start from the beginning and explain that to our audience?
Sure. And I think, just telling my journey kind of wraps it up nicely. So I started off in the cannabis industry after having a complete health collapse in 2012. I became a cannabis patient who happened to be a nurse. Saw some really profound outcomes of cannabis therapy that I did not expect. As a child, I grew up just south of Humboldt County, California, so I was super familiar with cannabis as a recreational tool. And for me, in retrospect, it even likely spared me the alcoholism path because it replaced alcohol for me in my early 20s, and I come from a long line of alcoholics. So, there was some benefit there, but to me, it was always a recreational tool, more so than a medicine, until I used it to replace opioids for chronic pain and saw it do some even more profound things, like eventually reverse my autoimmune markers for lupus. My labs went from positive for lupus in 2013 to negative for lupus in the end of 2014. And so this really triggered my deep dive into the research as a nurse to try to understand how cannabis could provide these amazing health outcomes for me. And so that was kind of my start into the industry. My daughter with autism benefited greatly from cannabis when she entered a crisis with puberty. So that's another whole story. And then, so in 2016, as I started to recover my own health, I began educating patients and helping to guide them with the goal of optimizing their cannabis therapy outcomes through finding products that matched their specific needs or their goals, and helping them understand the research and understand what was optimal, and understand that you shouldn't combine certain cannabis products with certain pharmaceuticals, things like that, just to help them really maneuver it and approach it in a well-informed manner, which as a nurse, that is one of the things I am bound to do by an oath. So in 2016, began seeing patients, built a business, integrated holistic care, had 3 nurses that I had trained with different specialties. We were consulting with patients, thousands of patients in the 3 years between 2016 and 2019. And in the end of 2019, the Oregon State Board of Nursing basically put a gag order on nurses' education of cannabis patients. And having seen what a profound benefit that could be for patients, and that ethically as nurses, we had taken an oath to serve all patients without, or prejudice based on what they chose as medicine. So it really ethically is driven as well this way. So when the Oregon State Board of Nursing gagged nurses' ability to educate cannabis patients in Oregon, it shut down my business. All of my nurses quit because they all needed their nursing licenses. And at that point, I pivoted and began educating medical professionals. So I have accredited content for nurses.
I think that's when you were on the show initially. It was back in 2019. You were right in the middle of that pivot.
Yes. And it was just like, well, my business is shut down. What do I do now? And it was a good pivot. Accredited content for nurses through Cannabis Nurses Network. And that kind of also led to my being hired as a college professor in 2020 to teach cannabinoid science. And it is a Department of Education approved class. The curricula is, they have either bachelor's or master's degrees in integrative medicine with cannabinoid science concentration. So it's a really great program, very unique. And so that's kind of the direction I went. In April or so of 2021, Leland Berger reached out to me and said, hey, are you ready to do something about this cannabis nurse gag order in Oregon? It's unlawful. He cited Conant versus Walters and nurses' freedom of speech to support that. And we did have the gag order forcibly rescinded by the Oregon State Board of Nursing. It happened very quickly, and Lee was almost like, why did we wait so long to do this? It happened very fast. Well, my next order of business with OSBN was to say, okay, are you ready to stop forcing nurses who are educating cannabis patients and guiding them and serving them to operate in this gray area, which leaves us susceptible to scrutiny by the Oregon State Board of Nursing, because basically the problem is that they haven't adopted scope of practice guidelines for nurses' education of cannabis patients. And so once we cleared up the gag order, we thought, okay, well, and another thing that happened in that same time frame, SB 3669 passed, which specifically protects nurses' education of cannabis patients. So we had that behind us as well. Said, okay, are you guys ready to adopt a scope of practice? I'm happy to be a resource for you and educate why this is important in Oregon and why this really should have been done 25 years ago when we made the law initially. And their response at OSBN was to investigate me. It was like 2 weeks after Leland Berger said, hey, what about a scope of practice, that I got the letter saying that I was being investigated for breach of scope, which is ironic because to this day, they still have not adopted a scope. And so nurses are forced to operate in a gray area. Since there was no specific incident, there was no specific patient file, it actually goes against OSBN's own rules, stating that they cannot pursue vague allegations, and they certainly did, and they used it as an excuse to comb through 5 full years of my work in the cannabis industry as a nurse, trying to find something to discipline me on. And they came up empty after a year. It was a pretty traumatic year, and it was not easy. And in April of 2022, my case was dismissed. No discipline was recommended. And I knew that I was going to be, reconnecting with Lee and saying, okay, now what about this scope of practice? It's one of the things that OSBN, they have very few jobs, and one of them is to provide a scope for nurses in specialty areas, which of course they've failed to do for 25 years. And so knowing that I was going to be rattling their cage more, many other factors kind of played into that, but I felt good about kind of boycotting OSBN and their unethical decisions around cannabis and how to serve cannabis patients. And so in May of 2022, I retired my nursing license. It did help that none of my other roles that I'm performing right now required a nursing license. It helped that I've since received some diagnoses that mean I won't be operating as a nurse at the bedside any longer. So really didn't have any use for it, and decided it was too big of a life and that this advocacy was too important. So let my nursing license go in 2022. Leland Berger just in the last couple of weeks has submitted a petition to Oregon State Board of Nursing, again, asking them to adopt a scope of practice for nurses serving cannabis patients. So, here we are. I feel like we kind of came full circle from where we were last time. We haven't made a ton of progress, but we're still going at it. So.
Right. They've tried to tear you down and fortunately failed, and now you're back to square one again.
Yeah, and part of it was really good affirmation from Oregon State Board of Nursing that they went through all of my materials, and they didn't find a darn thing that they could discipline me on. And so to me, that was just further confirmation that this material I'm teaching other nurses and medical professionals is solid as far as the ambiguity and scope that we see in a lot of places. So that to me was worth it as well.
Especially from a board that is obviously antipathetic to this issue. For them to leave it alone is about the best you can hope for with the makeup of these people who don't have any education in this realm. In fact, they have miseducation in terms of, it causes your brain to go idle and all sorts of other myths that we need medical professionals to dispel. And fortunately, the science is on our side. So it's just a simple matter of continuing this until, either they change or the youngsters come along that have been educated properly, right?
Absolutely. And that's another big issue. I mean, when I was going through all of this, I had a representative at ONA that I've worked with on different advocacy aspects in the cannabis industry and for nurses. It's Oregon Nurses Association. And she actually confided in me that she thought the reason all of that went down was because the late executive director of OSBN was notoriously anti-marijuana, was the term she used.
Yeah.
That director has retired now as of last fall. And we just got word that Rachel Prusak is one of 2 finalists to come in as the new executive director of OSBN. And I'm really hopeful that she will be assigned because she is a nurse practitioner. She has worked with cannabis patients in Oregon. She's very familiar with the science as an Oregon representative. She was a House of Representatives member for many years. She advocated for cannabis at the legislative level. So I'm really hopeful that she'll get in there and we can kind of tag team and clean it up in the next year or so. So we're hopefully seeing a light at the end of the tunnel for nurses in Oregon that understand the ethical dilemma that we face as nurses here. And, it's like you said, it's not based on any kind of logic or fact. It's all based on stigma and misinformation and propaganda and even probably some profit-driven motives.
Oh, definitely. There.
Yeah.
Do you know about the late great UCLA Dr. Donald Tashkin and how he converted from supporting the drug war in terms of he's one of those people who suffocated monkeys with 2,000 marijuana cigarettes in an hour, and then said there was lung damage. But he continued the science and eventually found that people who smoked cannabis were less likely to have lung cancer, and people who smoked cannabis and used tobacco were less likely to have lung cancer than people who never smoked anything at all. And so the facts finally came out, and he followed through on that. But it's like a whole generation was raised with this misinformation that came from pseudoscience, and it's starting to change, fortunately. I know one of the things that we've been talking about is cannabis in a medical setting, in retirement homes, and how the law says it's supposed to be allowed. We passed a law that says patients can choose medical marijuana, but that isn't an option is it an option anywhere that you know of?
There are a handful of homes in the Portland area, and I know this by proxy through my work with Anthony Taylor and Clifford Spencer who are serving patients that are in long-term care facilities or assisted living facilities. And they've gone in and educated the administrators. They've taken it upon themselves to kind of create this model that allows for cannabis to be added to the medication list for a patient staying in one of these homes, and the med aid can administer along with the other medications. So it is happening on a very, very limited basis. I'm actually on the Ryan's Law advocacy team and we do have it introduced this year as SB 3567 in Oregon legislature. Of course, this session is just kind of a joke with all of the division between the parties and how that's affecting it. So we're not
explain what Ryan's Law is? That's a
Yes.
California law, right?
Yes, it passed in California in 2021 as SB 311. And what it does is it protects the patient's right to access cannabis while hospitalized. In California, it's specific to terminal patients. In Oregon, we were trying to expand upon that a little bit and use the term palliative care, which would be cannabis being used for any comfort care of any kind, whether it be chronic illness or autism or cancer or mental health or whatever. So we're really trying to protect patients' right to access cannabis. This would be in addition to the law that you referenced earlier. Through OMMP, a patient can add a medical care facility or organization as an additional caregiver on their OMMP card. So there can be a second caregiver that's listed as a medical organization. Under the list of definitions under that statute, it includes things like licensed care homes and long-term care facilities, and it really is specific about which locations are protected. But through my advocacy for Autism Safe Haven, which is my 501c3 nonprofit, we are committed to creating cannabis inclusive autism care resources. Obviously, my daughter is the inspiration for that. And the licensing division for care homes in Oregon has a policy that absolutely prohibits cannabis inclusion in licensed care homes. And so this really means my daughter, who is 21 now, is literally having to choose between having a more independent type of lifestyle where she's not stuck at home being cared for by mom and dad because she is dependent on cannabis. She's literally having to choose between her cannabis therapy and the care that she could really benefit from right now. And it's been that way for a few years. We've been fighting this. And we have pointed out to the licensing board for care homes that their policy is in breach of a statute protecting that right. We've sent them all the information. They come up with all kinds of excuses. It really comes down to, and we see this a lot in the legislature and at OSBN, willful ignorance and just hoping they can sweep it under the rug and it'll go away. They come up with excuses like they don't want to jeopardize federal funding by accommodating cannabis patient care. And we actually have written correspondence that we got through advocacy of Ryan's Law California with Jim Bartell, written correspondence from federal CMS that pays out for Medicare funding. And they confirmed that they have not and they will not withhold federal funding for a medical organization accommodating cannabis patients' needs. So we've debunked that one. Another one we came up with was that caregiving staff in a licensed care home could not physically touch cannabis products. And I think we haven't gotten clarity on this yet. They kind of started ignoring us. We may have to pull in an attorney to get them to talk to us again. But I suspect that has to go, that they think the 280E federal tax law for employment that specifically is for employees in the cannabis industry that are cultivating or producing or retailing products must somehow apply, but it does not. The caregiving is not in that statute at all. So it's almost like they just look for excuses to say, no, we don't. And the ombudsman, they began ignoring the ombudsman too, that I reached out to mediate, because OMMP is under OHA, the licensing division for care homes is under OHA. It's like, can we get you guys talking? And they're ignoring the ombudsman now too. So it can be very frustrating to be an advocate in this industry, I have to tell you.
Yeah. Well, tell us about the classes that you are teaching. What's the name of the university again?
John Patrick University, and it's their School of Integrative Medicine, Integrative and Functional Medicine. So they have a lot of medical and lifestyle types of college degrees. My course is SCI 306, CBD and Cannabis Formulations. It can be audited, so anybody can take the class alone without enrolling in the entire program, which is really nice. And it's good for 3 college credits upon completion, successful completion. And basically, they came to me in 2020 and said, we want to create this program. It's taught by clinicians for clinicians. So our students come away with a lot of knowledge about how to best apply cannabinoid science and therapy for their future patients. It really is unique that way. There's a lot of programs that teach cannabinoid science now at the college level, but most of them are just really theory heavy, and they don't have teachers that have actually worked with patients and understand, the nuances of assessment and writing care plans and really helping that patient be guided in an individual manner. So it's pretty exciting. They let me pick up the textbooks and create it from scratch, so it was fun.
Any of the clinicians that are participating?
Quite a few. So we also launched the Institute of Cannabinoid Medicine, and in that we have people like Bonnie Goldstein and Rachel Knox, and a bunch of the really big names that you see at conferences and things like that that are collaborating and helping to build these education programs. So it is pretty exciting stuff. Janella Chin and Uma Donabalon was in there. So yeah, it's a great program, very unique.
Sounds like.
Very rigorous.
Is it 3 times a year or twice a year?
It's on a semester program, so it's 3 semesters per year. The semesters are 15 weeks, very rigorous. Like I said, my students, I've actually had them come back and say, I didn't think this was going to be so difficult. So it is, it's a master's degree. So it is something that takes a good commitment to learn it at that level and do the deep dive into the science. But it's been a lot of fun. And here I am. I first taught in January of 2021 my course, and I'm already updating it.
Sure.
This summer or fall. That's how
things on.
Yeah, it happens so fast.
So can you talk about how it's structured in terms of the subject matter, or what other interesting information can we glean from that?
So it really was driven by the learning objectives that were approved by the Department of Education. My textbooks are Curious About Cannabis by Jason Wilson, which is a very scientifically rigorous book. I don't know if any of you have read it, but I highly recommend it. It definitely goes into like the botany of the plant and the chemical components of the plant, the research on their optimal therapeutic uses and kind of what kind of patient outcomes we've seen, goes into each one of the compounds and the chemical structure of them. And then we kind of pivot and go into the medical and clinical application of cannabis therapy. My other textbook is Cannabis Pharmacy. So that's another good one that kind of goes into patient uses and different chemotypes or phenotypes or strains that we call them, and kind of how that breaks down and how to best target a patient's need by really looking at the cannabinoid and terpene profile is very important. So, many people think it's just all about that THC, when realistically that's not the case. There's, over 150, 165 now, I think we've come up to cannabinoids that the flower can produce and over 200 terpenes. Kind of depending on how those are mixed and matched, you're going to get a variety of effects from that. Some intoxicating, most not, CBD, CBG, CBN, CBC. We have so many cannabinoids now that are not intoxicating at all and are fairly readily available as hemp in the United States. So it really is kind of opening up this whole new world for patients that legal access to THC. But then explaining that, the terpenes, which you can think of as the essential oils that the cannabis plant produces, they actually drive, whether it's called sativa or, energizing, motivating, or indica, which is a couch lock and sedative. And just like essential oils, the terpenes have medical uses supported by the research in their own right. For example, myrcene, which is found in cannabis, also in mangoes, can help the cannabis cross the blood-brain barrier. So if you're targeting anything that's brain-related, that's a great terpene to look for in your medicine. Linalool is another one I love. It's also found in lavender as well as cannabis, and it's supported for reducing anxiety and seizures. So if somebody has anxiety or seizures, looking for linalool is a great approach. So that's the kind of things that I'm teaching my students.
That's fascinating. I find it fascinating. What do you think about the mother cannabinoid, CBG, and its medical efficacy? I've heard a lot of good things that it can be used for and non-intoxicating.
Absolutely. I love CBG. I take it every day. In fact, I took some drops when we first started out because I'm getting a little headache, and it's got CBG in it. CBG is very unique. It works differently from THC and CBD in that it's an agonist for the CB2 receptor. So it's a great cannabinoid for targeting anything in the immune system or in the gut as far as different imbalances that we might have. And it's CBGA, or the acid form of CBG, that is what we call the stem cell cannabinoid, from which almost every other cannabinoid is derived. We're actually finding now that there's the CBGVA, and that seems to be the stem cell cannabinoid for the variants, for the THCV and the CBDV, which is kind of some of the newer compounds that are becoming available. Really good for diabetes and weight loss and metabolic support. But CBGA really was the main stem cell from which THC is derived, and CBD and CBC and so many other of these wonderful cannabinoids. And so it's also, very therapeutic. CBGA research is pretty new. Product availability is fairly new. So we're still kind of getting a grasp on exactly what it might be good for, but it is showing some really great potential for anti-inflammatory effects. And then when it's heated and that CBGA, the acid drops off and it becomes CBG, that has a completely different group of benefits that it can offer.
Really? What are those? Can you say?
Yeah, CBG, being a CB2 agonist, as I mentioned earlier, is pretty good for things like immune system. It's anti-inflammatory. It's good for anything that's in the gut imbalances. When you look at the anatomy of the endocannabinoid system in our body, the CB2 receptors that CBG will target are most prolific in the immune system and in the gut. With the exception of somebody that's had a traumatic brain injury, there is research showing that when somebody has inflammation in their brain, the brain will upregulate or produce extra CB2 receptors where they normally are not very prolific. So it's almost like the brain is begging for CBG, or beta-carotenin is another CB2 agonist that will activate that CB2 receptor. So it's just really about listening to our bodies and what they're asking for when it comes down to it. So
I see. And that's kind of trial and error, I guess.
Well, our goal with, looking at the research and teaching the research to patients and following the research, but also following patient outcomes, is to really reduce the trial and error length for patients and help them get through that experimental process and find what works for them more quickly.
Yeah, you can specifically say, use the CBGA for this condition and the linalool for things that need to cross the blood-brain barrier, as you were saying.
Yeah.
So
Myrcene.
myrcene? Okay.
Myrcene,
Myrcene in
Myrcene.
hops too?
It is, I believe so. Yep. It's also found in mangoes. That's why, people used to talk about smoke a joint, eat a mango, and it'll improve your high. Well, that's why, because it expedites it getting into the brain.
I see. I didn't really get that effect myself, but everybody's different, right? We all have slightly different metabolisms for those sorts of things.
And that's part of what makes cannabis so much different from our mainstream approach, is that even with all of this knowledge and guiding patients, we still have the caveat that everybody's individual response can differ. So while an anxiety formula might work beautifully for one patient, another patient, it might not work for at all. A certain dose might work for one patient, and another patient might need a completely different dose to have the same effect. So it's still a lot of, well, let's start here. This product looks like it might be a good fit. We're going to start you low, increase slowly, stop where you feel good, journal it, make back, and you know, you can get pretty complex with it. And my daughter's regimen is a pretty good example of that. She takes CBD, CBG, THCA, THC, beta carotene, CBN, a bunch of different formulations every morning and night. And I sort of tweak it based on how she looks any given day. Autism is one of these conditions where she can be great one day and the next day be painful, or the next day be anxious and behavioral. And so you can kind of adjust what you're giving to meet that person's need in that moment, which is really nice. And even if her capsule in the morning is not enough, we can give her extra throughout the day. We don't have to worry about overdosing because it has an unsurpassed safety profile. The LD50, or dose at which a substance would kill 50% of people, for cannabis, the LD50 is lower than caffeine and sugar and alcohol and all these other things that are completely over the counter and readily available to patients. So
Let's talk a little bit more about cannabis and autism. I know you have a lot of experience in that area. How do you think cannabis affects autism? Is it part of a deficiency in the endocannabinoid system, or what can you tell us?
yeah, so clearly, you know, for my daughter, I've done quite a bit of research. When I was working with patients, I was predominantly working with autism parents and helping them help their child. So quite a bit of experience. I've written on it extensively and taught on it extensively. And so what I have gleaned is that one contributing factor for those that are suffering autism is endocannabinoid deficiency. And so, like I was talking about earlier, we have an endocannabinoid system in our body with all these receptors. That same system also produces cannabinoids. We produce cannabinoids inside our body that are pretty closely, uh, they're very close in structure and function to the cannabinoids from the plant. And when we can't
Well, I was just thinking,
go
my
ahead.
understanding is that the cannabinoids modulate the other neurotransmitters in the neurological system, that the flow of these transmitters is in one direction, and cannabis and cannabinoids, and the endocannabinoids specifically, go in the opposite directions, and are ideally going to help establish homeostasis or balance of all your body functions. Is that a good analogy?
Yes, and so neurotransmitters, that's kind of specific to your brain and the neurological system. But you are correct, cannabinoid, and what you spoke to of, you know, the direction of the cannabinoids in the neurotransmitters, that's something called retrograde signaling, which highly recommend anyone that wants to do a deeper dive into that. It's fascinating. It's a mechanism by which there's no other substance known to have this feedback mechanism in the neurological system, where it can actually kind of gauge what's happening and then act in a way that's going to balance them. And with neurotransmitter, it's tricky because you can have too much of one thing and not enough of another, or the opposite, or, you know, any combination thereof. And so the fact that the endocannabinoid system in cannabis can really modulate that in a very intelligent manner. They actually see what's happening and then go in and fix it. It's retrograde signaling, fascinating. But then the rest of the endocannabinoid system and our receptors that are in every other system of the body, not just the brain and the gut and the immune system like we've talked about today, but they're in the skeletal system, and they're in the skin system, the integumentary system. They're you know, throughout the body. And so, and you're correct, when we can't produce enough endocannabinoids in our body, which can happen for several reasons, and which Dr. Ethan Russo links with every chronic illness when you have endocannabinoid deficiency. When we don't have enough of those, we can actually supplement the cannabinoids from the plant, and they kind of seamlessly fill in for that deficiency and promote homeostasis, which is our fancy word for optimal health balance throughout the body, not just in the brain. So that's very, it kind of explains this misconception that I often see in medical professionals. They hear cannabis is good for everything and they write it off as snake oil. And it's like, no, you're not understanding. that it promotes balance. And the underlying cause of all illness and disease is imbalances. So when you look at it from that broad perspective, it really makes a lot more sense. And in autism, which we're getting back to the subject, it is linked with endocannabinoid deficiency. Bonnie Goldstein, who is one of our medical advisory board members for Autism Safe Haven, did a study last year where they actually found biomarkers for the endocannabinoid system in autism that were deficient, and then showed that when we supplement with cannabis from the plant, it actually improves those marker levels. So it really palpably shows that cannabis supplementation improves a known deficiency in autism, which is huge. And not to mention that cannabis is just such a great answer for a lot of the symptoms of autism, whether it be social anxiety, whether it be, brain inflammation, whether it be immune system imbalances or gut imbalances or neurological imbalances of other forms. Those are all very viable targets for cannabis therapy.
One of the things that we find a lot of patients who are dealing with cancer is the use of high potency cannabis. Some people call it full extract cannabis oil or FECO. Another popular name is Rick Simpson oil or RSO, and that somehow it causes your immune system to target these cells that it hasn't recognized before and causes these cancer cells to die, or apoptosis, I believe it's called, the programmed cell death. Do you want to address that and how you deal with that in your curriculum?
Sure, yeah, and I've worked with a lot of cancer patients as well. That's one of the probably top uses for people that decide to try cannabis. And so there's a study from NIH, I believe it was 1972. I actually have a copy of the PDF I'm happy to share with you. But this study in the 1970s showed that THC, the most villainized cannabinoid of all, actually triggers apoptosis of cancer cells. Now, we all have cancer cells floating throughout our body every day. The difference between someone like me that does not have cancer and a patient that does have a tumor and it's growing and it's metastasizing is the immune response. It also has to do with the cancer cells themselves being mutant cells. And through that mutation, that apoptosis mechanism, that programmed cell death you talked about, actually gets turned off. And so when a patient takes THC, and just quick caveat, THC is not recommended for all forms of cancer. So if you have cancer and you're seeking cannabis, please get knowledgeable medical oversight because it can literally make or break your response. But THC, when a patient takes high doses of that, actually trigger these cells to turn back on the programmed cell death. And apoptosis, they die, your body flushes it out, which, as it sounds, is a much safer process than the chemotherapy and radiation approach, which is life-threatening, right?
Yeah,
So,
it's poisoning your whole body to make these cells supposedly that are a little weaker die if it doesn't cause you to die in the process.
Through a natural mechanism that our body would normally do.
Right.
It's nothing foreign or chemical, and it's certainly not harmful. There are a few things like you mentioned, RSO versus FACO. When I hear RSO, I always want to dig a little deeper and find out what solvent was used in producing the cannabis. Because Rick Simpson, he was a pioneer. He did some great work. He helped a lot of people. But I don't agree with the solvents that he recommends because they are very toxic. Acetone, naphtha, isopropyl alcohol. Like if there's any residuals, and especially with these patients that are making it at home and not lab testing it to rule out any residuals, it can be really dangerous. The full extract cannabis oil is basically the same end product as Rick Simpson oil, but they use that terminology to differentiate themselves as using food grade solvents, usually a food grade 190 proof ethanol like Everclear. I've gotten to where I use organic 190 proof sugarcane alcohol to make my FACO. That's a much better option because we know even if there is a little bit of residual, it's not going to harm somebody, right?
What forms of cancer would cannabis not be recommended for? You'd say don't, you know, don't try cannabis because it could have the opposite effect.
Um, what I was referring to in THC specifically, people with cancer think, oh, I just need to go out and get FICO, high dose THC and take it. There are forms of cancer, specifically estrogen or other hormone driven cancers, where THC should be really limited if used at all. And we don't yet fully understand.
And ovarian cancer or other forms of cancer too.
Breast, ovarian, testicular, prostate, fallopian, all of those things, ovarian, all if and they can actually go in and biopsy the cancer cells and tell you if they have the hormone receptors on the cancer cell. And if there's hormone receptors on a cancer cell, hormones actually feed it. So you don't want to be increasing your hormone levels. And what we have found with especially high doses of THC is that it can increase hormone levels. This makes it a great option for women that are going through menopause and their estrogen levels are dropping, and they can get good relief from THC because it'll increase their levels and kind of ease them into it. But for somebody that has a cancer that feeds off of hormones, we don't want to be increasing hormones, right?
Okay.
We want to avoid high dose THC. So for those patients, high dose CBD is very effective. It actually blocks a pathway called GPR55, and cancer cells rely on that pathway to grow and spread. So if we can block that pathway with high dose CBD, we can get that patient a good leg up on it. CBG is also really good for things like colorectal cancer, for supporting the immune system. The acids can be really beneficial for reducing inflammation, which is going to improve the immune function overall. So there are other cannabinoids that can be good for hormone-driven cancers. THC is just not one that we recommend.
What about the route of administration? I mean, my preferred way of using cannabis, as I started out as a smoker, as a young teenager, but since about the past 20 years, I switched to the volcano vaporizer. I still like that. Seems to be the most efficient, easier to clean than some of those handheld ones. But most of these, well, the tinctures, obviously, and other edible cannabis, they talk about sublingual administration, but doesn't most of that go down in the gut anyway? And then there's another option of having it through a suppository method. That's the word I'm searching for. What do you want to tell us about these various routes of administration in medicinal cannabis?
There's just so many options, as you just listed. For starting out, I tend to recommend tinctures for patients because they're really versatile. They're easy to dose. You can literally count the number of drops and know how many milligrams you're taking, which as a nurse, I really like that. I teach my patients to track that. What was your pain level? How much did you take of what product and how did it help? And then next time you go back and you say, hey, well, my pain's about the same and it didn't help quite as much as it should, so maybe I should take a little more, stuff like that. Under the tongue, most people feel the sublingual dose within about 10 to 15 minutes. So it's fairly fast acting, which can be advantageous. But you're correct. Even once you soak it in your mouth for about a minute and let it absorb through all your mucous membranes, you do swallow it. And so oral administration or swallowing it, whether it be the oil from a tincture, whether it be in a capsule, whether it be an edible in a food, is going to go through liver past metabolism. And so this means it's going to take longer to kick in, probably 30 minutes to an hour. Some people even up to 2 hours, depending on what you eat with it can change it. And then you're stuck with it for a lot longer, 6 to 8 hours, where sublingual is usually 2 to 3. Same with inhalation, kicks in quickly, wears off quickly. And so, I normally teach patients start with your tincture, do your experimentation. If they really don't like the taste of it, they can drop it in a capsule and swallow it. But I suggest kind of knowing what dose works before doing that. Because like I said, if you get too much THC and you swallow it, you're stuck with it for a while. The suppository method, I have patients that have sworn that they get relief from cannabis suppositories. We don't yet understand how that is. And the area of the colon where a suppository is inserted is really good at reabsorbing water soluble contents. Cannabis is oil soluble, it's fat soluble. And a lot of times the suppository molds are made with cannabis oil and coconut oil, which is fat soluble. And so it's really, there's an ongoing debate about whether suppositories actually absorb effectively into our system. And there's even a nurse practitioner I've worked with for many years, Eloise Thiessen, who wrote a paper on it and basically exemplified that if a THC suppository was absorbing, it would be going through liver past metabolism and it would be causing profound intoxication, which it does not. So that's one of the big arguments.
Is that it doesn't cause intoxication. And that's, huh?
So is it absorbing? How much is absorbing?
Yeah. Or how much gets
the question.
out? That's the other question.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think patients and they find relief from them, as long as there's no risk factors like potential for aggravating a tumor that's in that area or causing scratching it and causing infection, something like that. Go ahead, keep using it, but add a product that we know absorbs, that we know you're getting your full doses, so that you can get the most benefit from it. That's usually my advice.
Well, we're almost out of time. I've had Janna Champagne on with a retired nurse who's been teaching medical students about the cannabis and endocannabinoid system, phyto and endocannabinoid. What would you like to say in closing, Janna?
Well, thanks again for having me. This went so fast. Oh my gosh. I guess when you're passionate about something, it's a lot of fun. So if you know, go ahead.
Anything in particular you wanted to touch on that we haven't touched on?
I think we pretty well covered everything. My newest thoughts and on cannabis is a harm reduction tool comparing to mainstream and pharmaceutical approaches. It's usually objectively more potentially beneficial and less potentially harmful or risky. So you'll find some of that. Anybody that wants to reach out or take a look at what I'm doing or see samples of my work can go to jannachampagne.com, spelled just like the screen, Janna, and then champagne like the drink. So that's a great resource, and you can find a lot of the research that I've talked about today in papers that I've written as the citations. So.
All right. And maybe a link to that university course and other things, hopefully.
Yes, absolutely. It's jpu.edu is John Patrick University, and it's the School of Integrative and Functional Medicine is where you'll find the cannabinoid science content.
I have for about 20 years now specifically searched out integrative practitioners, which is becoming more and more popular. No, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, they think outside the box, which is so vital right now. So.
All right. Well, thanks for being on, Janna Champagne, and you still have Unity products, right?
Yeah, unityformulas.com. They have hemp CBD tinctures and free nurse guidance for anybody that has questions about interactions with pharmaceuticals or what product might be the best fit, for example. So.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on again. I really have enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing you again. You have a good one.
And I'll drop you a coupon code for Unity Formulas too. So make myself a note to do that for your listeners.
Okay. We'll put that up on the website here. We keep working to restore hemp. Good night.
Thank you. Sure will. Thank you, Paul.